We also have inheritance in TypeScript whenever we're working with classes. So for example, I can have another class. So let's say I have another class. So I'm going to say class, and let's say this is US citizen, right? So this US citizen is going to extend the person class, right? So we're going to say extends person. And this is enough that we have to do. We don't even have to do anything else. And what's going to happen is the US citizen class is going to inherit everything from the person class. So for example, I can come down here and then I can say const and say John, and this is going to be a new US citizen. And then as you can see, it's expecting the parameters from the parent class. And then here I can pass in an ID, and then I can pass in a name. In this case, that's going to be John. And if I console log John, so console.log and pass in John, and this is supposed to be lowercase, and then go ahead and run that. You can see that US citizen 5, and then for the ID, and then the name is John. So we're technically inheriting from this constructor, as you can see here. So that's all we have to do. We just have to say extends person, and then we can use everything that exists inside of the person class. Now we can also have our own constructor inside of here. So let's say, for example, we wanted to take a social security number. So we would say something like private SSN, and let's say this is going to be a string. In that case, we would need to define a constructor. So we can say constructor, and then we're going to take the SSN. So we're going to say SSN, also a string. Now, very important is whenever you extend a class and then you have your own constructor, you have to call the super keyword. So that's how you invoke the constructor of the parent class. So when we call the super keyword, we're invoking this constructor inside of the person class, because that's the class that we're extending, as you can see here. And we know that this is expecting an ID and a name. So let's grab an ID and then let's pass in a name. So we're going to say John. And then we can continue down and then say this.ssn and then pass in the SSN that we got from the constructor. And that would work just fine. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of this, and then I'm going to say the SSN is just some number like this. So now if I go ahead and run this, you're going to see that we have the ID 5, the name of John, and then the SSN. So now let's say we want to get all of this information when we create the instance from the US citizens, right? So we don't want to pass something hard-coded here. That's pretty much useless. You probably would never do this because you don't want to take hard-coded values. So what we can do is to do the same thing. So in here, I'm going to say private, and I can also do it on the class as well. Like I can duplicate this line, and then I'm going to say, you know, ID like this, but we're going to use the shorthand notation. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these two lines. And then inside of the constructor, I'm going to say, we're going to take an ID as well. So I'm going to say private ID, and this is going to be a number, and then private name, and that's going to be a string. And lastly, we're going to take the social security number. So I'm going to move this a little bit over. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and close this for now. So close, and the constructor, right? I'm taking the ID, I take the name, and then I take a social security number. So then when I call the super class, because I'm extending the parent class, which is person, and the person class, it takes the ID and it takes the name. So what I have to do, I have to use the super keyword. And when I call the super keyword, I have to pass in whatever the constructor of the parent class is expecting. In this case, that's the ID and the name. So here I'm getting the ID here. So when I call the super, I pass in the ID, and then I pass in the name instead of hard coding it. So here I'm going to say name. So this is going to call the constructor of the person class, so this class, and then pass in those values to the constructor so that we can construct our citizen or US citizen instance, which in this case is going to be John. And then now all we have to do is to supply those values to the constructor at this point so that we can have a code that is more dynamic. So we can say 10 for the ID, the name is going to be Junior this time, and then the social security number is going to be the same. And I'm also going to change this to Junior, and let's make this lowercase. And we're getting this error because those cannot be private anymore. So I'm going to remove the private keyword. And if I go ahead and run this at this point, and bring this over a little bit, you can see that we have our US citizen, ID 10, name Junior, and the social security number. So we were able to call the parent constructor when we were calling the constructor of the US citizen so that we can construct this instance down here. So there's a lot of work that gets done when we call this constructor and pass in these values, because we have to call the parent constructor by using the super keyword, and then we pass in the values that it's expecting. In this case, that's the ID and the name, and then we pass in our own. Well, we didn't even have to do this because we're taking it here as a private SSN. So if I go ahead and run it again, you can see that we get the result all the same. So just so you really understand what I'm doing here. So let's say we're going to define this at the class level, right? So I'm going to come up here and then paste this in. So this is going to be the private SSN. And then I'm going to accept this SSN here. And then I'm going to say, all right, when we call the constructor, set that SSN to whatever we got from the constructor, just like that. So this is the long way of doing this, not using the shorthand. So if I go ahead and run this again, you can see it's working all the same. So instead of doing all this, we agreed earlier that we could just pass those in inside of the constructor, pass all the properties inside of the constructor, and then the constructor will take care of creating those properties at the class or inside of the class. So instead of doing this here, we can just remove it. Also remove this assignment because we don't need it, and just make this private. And that's all we have to do. So if I go ahead and run it again, we get the same result. So always remember, if you're going to use the long way of setting the properties on the class, then you have to call the super keyword and then pass those values that the parent constructor needs first. And then you can start assigning your values like this, SSN, etc., etc. You just have to remember that you have to use the super keyword first in the constructor. So the first line inside of your constructor should be you calling the super keyword and then passing the values that the parent constructor is expecting. In this case, the ID and the name. And then you do the rest of your assignment. Or you can just do it the short way, which is more elegant. You just pass in the access modifier in front of the new properties that you're adding that are not going to be passed inside of the super keyword. And then you just create your instance that way. And this is a lot cleaner, to be honest.